So this is, in many ways, the climax of this letter that Paul is writing, most likely from a prison cell in Rome to the church that he had planted some time before in Philippi. And in this section of the letter, the theme running in the background is this, that the gospel, the good news of Jesus the King, calls people to make a decision. Is your loyalty to Caesar, or is your loyalty to Jesus? Whether you're a resident of Philippi and therefore a citizen of Rome, and we'll come to that in a moment, called to choose between the actual Caesar and Jesus, or whether you are a citizen of Wolverhampton, called to choose between Jesus and all of the modern day Caesars, money, sex, power, and so on. The question in the background of this passage is, who are you going to follow? And so verse 17, Paul says this. Let's look through the passage together. Join together in following my example. Paul basically says to them, follow me. Now, before we think he's being really arrogant and thinking he's got it all right, he's just admitted in the verses before that he's not there yet. He's not finished. He's not the complete article just yet. And keep in mind also that this comes after all the teaching that we've heard in the letter so far. This is coming from a man who considers everything a loss compared to knowing Jesus. And actually this line can be translated in two different ways, quite legitimately. And the other way is that it might be saying, be imitators with me. Join together with me in imitating. Imitating who? Or based on the letter, clearly Jesus. And he goes on, and just as you have us as a model, keep your eyes on those who live as we do. Philippi was located on one of the major trade routes running kind of east-west through the Roman Empire. And so there would have been many people stopping through at Philippi on their way to Rome. Plenty of teachers like Paul. And some of these teachers would have been brilliant and helpful and encouraging and all of that, but others would have just been bad or misleading. Which is why Paul goes on to say in verse 18, for as I have often told you before, and now tell you again, even with tears, many live as enemies of the cross of Christ. In other words, there will be people who pass through Philippi, and there'll be people who pass through Wolverhampton or across our social media feed who stand against the message of the cross, who are hostile to the message of Jesus. That is not the message that the crucified Messiah is the risen Lord of all the world is not a popular message. Because if Jesus is Lord, then Caesar is not, and neither are you. And so Paul is warning them about all of this with tears in his eyes. Many of you will know that my son has just started at secondary school, having never been in the school environment outside of the home before. And I can really identify with what Paul is trying to do here as he kind of writes to this group of Christians who are like his children in the faith. And he's just longing for them to stay faithful, not to be swept along by the latest trend of teaching or by some misleading teacher. He wants them to stay faithful and true to Jesus. And I've been saying, not in these words, but in more or less the same thing to my son as he's started at school. Keep your eyes on those who live as we do. For there are many who live as enemies of the cross of Christ. Not everything you hear will be true to the message of Jesus. And my concern for him is that he will stay following Jesus, that he will stand with Jesus, the risen Messiah. Paul goes on in verse 19 to lay out 4 markers of the enemies of the cross. And there is no two ways about it. It's quite a blunt assessment. Firstly, he says, their destiny is destruction. That word destiny is the word telos we had last week, if you were here in kind of verse 12. And in verse Paul is talking about his telos, his end goal, the ultimate destination that his life is moving towards. And Paul has said that for him, as a follower of Jesus, that end goal is resurrection from the dead. Here he uses the same word and says their end goal is destruction. There is coming a day when every human will stand before Creator God, and some will be resurrected and others destroyed. As I say, there's no way of sugarcoating, I don't think, what Paul is saying in these words, except to say that the invitation to Jesus and new life and resurrection is open to all people. Secondly, he says their God is their stomach. In other words, what they worship, what they come under the control of, is their stomach. And in those days, in the first century, the stomach was shorthand for bodily appetites, for food, for drink, and for sex drive. They come under the authority of their bodily appetites and desires. That is their God. I wonder if that sounds at all like any other culture you might be familiar with. I started out looking at kind of what the statistics for the UK might be, but I very quickly realised I could find out just as horrifying statistics for our own city of Wolverhampton. 70% of the adult population of Wolverhampton are overweight, and at least part of that is around our attitudes towards food. Deaths from alcohol and drug misuse are higher in Wolverhampton than anywhere in the Midlands. During 2020, Wolverhampton had the worst alcohol-specific mortality rate in the UK. And nearly 9,000 people in Wolverhampton are having an affair right now. And those are just the ones that this weird website that tracks that sort of information had reported to them. A 2017 survey found that Wolverhampton is the most promiscuous city in the country. Now, there is nothing wrong with food, there's nothing wrong with drink, and there's nothing wrong with sex. But when we take any of those good things and we take them out of their proper context, and we begin to worship them and elevate them to the point of idolatry, then food quickly turns into gluttony, drink quickly turns into drunkenness, and sex turns into pain or regret or shame or abuse. Their God is in their stomach. Sorry, their God is their stomach, he says. Thirdly, their glory is in their shame. You know, it is one thing to sin, to go our own way rather than God's way, to give in to our kind of bodily urges. But it is another thing entirely to glory in your shame, to brag about it, boast about it, to revel in all of that stuff. And so much of the programming on our televisions is dedicated to just that. I saw a horrifying thing that suggested the Big Brother house was about to make a return to our TV screens. It's reveling in all of that stuff, like so much of reality TV. And then fourthly, he says their mind is set on earthly things. What does he mean by that? Well, he wrote another letter at about the same time to the Colossians, and he expands a bit more fully there. Colossians chapter 3, verse 2, he says, set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. And then in that passage, he goes on to list things like sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires and greed, which is idolatry, anger, rage, malice, slander, and filthy language from your lips. These are the sorts of things Paul means when he says earthly things. Their minds are wrapped up in and consumed by these kinds of earthly things. And here Paul is writing to them, warning them with tears rolling down his cheeks. Don't follow people like that. And then in verse 20, Paul shifts to the other side of things, to the Philippians themselves. Verse 20, but our citizenship is in heaven, and we eagerly await a Saviour from there, the Lord Jesus Christ, who by the power that enables him to bring everything under his control will transform our lowly bodies, that they will be like his glorious body. Now, it's so easy to misunderstand what Paul is saying in this section. He's lining up for us the fact that there are two different colonies, and I'm aware that's a tricky word. There are two colonies, and these two colonies have two different futures. So firstly, these two colonies, he says, our citizenship is in heaven. Or another way we could translate that is, we are a colony of heaven. Now, I'm aware before I kind of go any further with that language that a colony is not normally seen as a good thing anymore. And colonialism has all the kind of negative connotations of kind of subverting another's culture and all of those sorts of things. What we need to kind of do to kind of really make sense of what Paul is saying here is to recognize the fact that Philippi is a colony of Rome. So they're living in that kind of a setup. They're living in a place that is a colony of Rome. And so Paul uses that language that they understand to help them see their role as citizens of heaven. So if you can kind of just park your kind of whatever your feelings about colonialism might be for now, and just kind of let's wrestle with what Paul is really saying here. Philippi was a colony of Rome. The Roman Empire was not the first empire to conquer the world. But the thing that made it last so long is that it was the first empire really to keep the world conquered for any length of time. And one of the key ways that they did that was through establishing these colonies. A colony was more than just a city. A colony was meant to be like a microcosm of Rome itself. Under the law, when you were in a colony like Philippi, you were standing on Roman soil. So you were exempt from Roman taxes, you were covered by Roman law and all of that. And a colony's job was to bring the rule and reign of Rome to the city and the areas surrounding it, to bring in its law and its justice, but also its culture and its art and its values and all of that stuff. And so what Rome did was they planted these colonies at strategic locations around the empire, and they populated them with Romans. Philippi itself was planted off the back of one of the great battles in the Roman Civil War in 42 BC, just after the death of Julius Caesar. And the victorious generals were Antony and Octavian. Octavian would become the Emperor Augustus. And they found themselves after this battle with loads of soldiers, Roman soldiers, in northern Greece with nothing more to do. But rather than bringing them all back to Rome, where they would probably just hang around causing trouble, they gave them land to live in and around Philippi. So instead of having loads of extra soldiers floating around Rome, now they had thousands of Romans in the heart of Macedonia. So when Paul writes to these people living in a colony of Rome and says to them, our citizenship is in heaven, he's underlining these two colonies that are in play. Now, I don't know what you think when you hear that phrase, our citizenship is in heaven. If you're like most people, you jump straight to this kind of slightly skewed understanding that we're just kind of waiting to, our citizenship really is in heaven. This world isn't really ours. We're just waiting to get up there somewhere where everything will be better. If anything, Paul is saying the exact opposite of that in this phrase. If you are living in a Roman colony, your hope is not to get back to Rome. Your goal is the opposite. Your goal is to bring Rome to Philippi, to establish Roman rule and influence, to Romanize Philippi, if you like. And in the same way, the Philippian church are called to bring the rule and the influence of heaven to Philippi. We might say their goal is to heavenize Philippi. Our goal here in St Matthew's is to heavenize Wolverhampton. And I'm well aware that I'm just making up a word at that point. Not the way that Rome did it, not with violence and power and subjugation and kind of overbearing legislation and all of that stuff, but through the way of Jesus, through the way of the cross, the way where we die to ourselves and live in the footsteps of Jesus. So there are these two colonies at work, and these two colonies have two different futures. Their destiny, Paul says, is destruction. We, on the other hand, eagerly await a saviour from there. Where? From heaven. The story of God, and again, this is often seen the other way round in the way people have often understood this. The story of God leads up to the point where Jesus returns to the earth. This is not how many people assume it's going to work. Many people think that we're waiting to the point where we die and we leave this earth to go to be somewhere else in heaven. But my understanding is that it works kind of the other way around. The story leads up to the point where Jesus returns to the earth, bringing the life of heaven with him. Which is why in the very last chapter of the Bible, we read about this wedding of Jesus and his church, this marriage between heaven and earth, brought together at last under the lordship of Jesus. So rather than heaven being the place we go when we die, for Paul, heaven is really the space where God rules and reigns, where life is as it should be under God's perfect rule. That is our ultimate hope. And when Jesus comes, Paul says, two things will happen. Firstly, he will bring everything under his control. Jesus will right every wrong. He will establish his perfect rule and restore all things to the way they're meant to be. He will come and put the world to rights. And then secondly, he will transform our frail bodies, that they will be like his glorious body. Paul's talking here about the body that Jesus is in right now, in light of his resurrection. He's highlighting for us that there is continuity and discontinuity between your body right now and the body you will inhabit in the resurrection. And if we think about Jesus' resurrection body, we can see this already a little bit. There is continuity. After the resurrection, Jesus has a body. He's not a ghost, he's not an angel, he's not a feather or a dove or a light or any of those things. He is a flesh and blood human being. One of the first things he says to his disciples after the resurrection is asking them for something to eat. I love that. But there is also discontinuity. Yes, Jesus has a body after the resurrection, but he can also turn up in a locked room and disappear again, seemingly at will. This is a new mode of physical being that doesn't work in entirely the same way. His resurrection body is a whole different kind of humanity. It's a brand new way to live. And that, Paul says, is what awaits followers of Jesus. Two colonies, two futures. What does this mean for us? What does this mean for us to be a colony of heaven? Last week we launched our new church vision. If you weren't here or you missed it, there's bookmarks at the back that you can take away and kind of have a read through in full. But our vision, as you can see on the banners at the front here, is to be those who are being transformed by Jesus and bringing transformation in our community. If we're going to heavenize Wolverhampton, let me just highlight a few specifics from our vision that we might need to be thinking about. Firstly, I think there's something about us committing to practicing spiritual disciplines, things like reading the scriptures, things like praying, but also things that we think perhaps a bit less about, like fasting and Sabbath and silence and solitude. We need to take some of these disciplines seriously, that we might enter into that kind of transformed life that Jesus wants to bring. And then the second part of our vision kind of bringing transformation in our community? How are we to heavenize East Park and Eastfield in particular? Well, there's something about being visibly at the heart of life in the community. We can't bring transformation to a community that we don't know and that doesn't know us. And there's some of this that will happen at a kind of an organisational level, for want of a better word. That some of it will just happen under the banner of St Matthew's and things that we do and organise. But much of it, if not most of it, will happen as individual members of St Matthew's go about their daily lives with your neighbours, with people that you're meeting in the park, in the local shops, as you go out to work. Those are the main opportunities we have day in, day out to bring the culture and the life of heaven into our community. And then one of the key phrases that we kept coming back to when we were looking at this new vision was this idea of breaking cycles. Enabling people who just are stuck for all sorts of different reasons in ways that are less than ideal, and enabling them somehow to access and receive the life that Jesus wants to bring, the transformation that only Jesus can bring. Now imagine a single mom on the verge of losing her children. And then imagine a church that is able to just draw alongside that mom through the toddler group, through a bit of parenting support, through just ongoing friendship, week in, week out, and loving and supporting that mom to the point where her relationship with her children is restored, and she enjoys parenting, and she works through all the things and the struggles that she had going on before. Imagine a couple on the verge of splitting up. Their relationship has become filled with arguments and shouting matches. And then imagine members of the church coming alongside that couple, befriending them, supporting them, listening to their struggle, being with them in the tough stuff, offering a word of advice in season, helping them to see the difference that Jesus might make, not just for their own lives, but for their relationship too, and imagine their relationship restored. Imagine a teenage lad on the verge of joining a local gang because he has nobody better to look up to. What would it be for us as a church, through our youth group, through our youth leaders, through just being around in the community, to be offering a space where that young lad can meet adults who love him and care for him and can show him a better way to be, who can introduce him to Jesus and the transformation on offer. That's what we mean by breaking cycles. Imagine what it would be for us as individuals and collectively as a church to be alongside this community, having been transformed by Jesus ourselves, to offer that same transformation to those around us. That's what we think it might mean for us as a church. But I want to just finish with the question of what does it mean for you? What might this mean for you? To heavenize your little kind of sphere of influence, whether it's your family or your workplace, your friends. What would it look like for you to bring the life of heaven into all those places where you spend your time day by day? It's going to encourage us to hold a moment to think about that question, and I'll lead us in a prayer.